It's my great pleasure to introduce Chris, Professor Chris Husbands. Chris is Director of the Institute of Education, newly joined with UCL, but as we all know, a very, very well-established part of academic work on education internationally and in this country. Chris is Professor of Education Policy, and I'm going to just hand straight over to Chris. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Richard. So good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for coming. And I think this is a first for UCL. I think this is the first lecture from the Institute of Education. So in that sense, it's something of almost an inaugural for UCL. It's my opportunity as director of the IOE to survey the field of education and say something pompous. And I can do pomposity, I can't survey the field of education. You'll realise very quickly that my intention to cover a lot of ground was doomed to fail. So I thought hard about where I should start in this first IOE lecture in UCL, and actually the only place to start is here. It's in classrooms. Some of these are from Julien Germain's striking photographs of classrooms, others are my own, others from various other sources, and look at them. Striking differences in size, in shape and walls, but they're all instantly recognisable as classrooms. And my guess is that you look at these and a part of your mind is transported back. Yes, you're 5, you're 6, you're 11, you're 12, in the classrooms of your childhood, and you remember who sat next to you, you remember the smells and the sounds. Classrooms are just everywhere in education. And they're not just in schools. Even more standardised, here they are, the lecture theatres of universities the world over. And we didn't need a slide. We could just look around for the instantly familiar, if somewhat forbidding. In fact, I can report to you an absolute cultural constant in lecture theatres the world over. For all the cultural differences, wherever you go, nobody ever wants to sit on the front row. These lecture theatres and classrooms are not just widespread, they are incredibly long-lasting. This is and again, perhaps somebody can correct me, the first picture I have ever found of a European classroom. It's in Bologna in the 14th century. And you can see in it almost all the features of classrooms that we recognise instantly. There you have it, the teacher at the front, the students sitting in rows, and at the moment of creation of the modern classroom, the creation of classroom disaffection. And you can run this pretty well through history. This is also in northern Italy. It's 700 years later. The same rows, the lecturer just out of shot, and he's been asleep for 700 years. And it's not just Europe, we can do it. This is in Sydney, in Australia. There's the teacher, there are the pupils, there's a bit of technology, but still there he is. And it is one of our most successful exports globally. This one is in Uganda, and there you have it, the boys in rows. But there it is again. In fact, I've learnt from all of these that the person to watch is the person sitting just about where you're sitting. If I keep you awake, then I'm fine. Now, classrooms are everywhere. They are long-lasting. They are persistent. Around the world, education has never mattered to more people than it does today. Expectations of education are greater than ever. For policymakers and practitioners, education is the economic and social investment par excellence. And in there, I think, really absorbing analysis of American economic, technical and social development, the race between education and technology, Claudia Goldin and Lawrence Katz argue that the 20th century was the American century because American economic success was driven by education. Americans were in a better position to invent, to be entrepreneurial, and to use goods. The nation, they argue, that invested the most in egalitarian educational opportunities and did that in the century in which education would critically matter was the nation that came out with the highest per capita income. This was America's great success. In the 80 years between 1900 and 1980, education attainment in America improved rapidly and continuously. America's failure, they argue, since the end of the 1970s has been the stalling of education improvement. For the first 3 quarters of the 20th century, they summarise, education raced ahead of technology. Later in the century, technology raced ahead of education. Now, around the world, it's the Goldin and Katz thesis that underpins education policy. Investment in human capital drives education reforms. The race to improve education systems is a race for economic advantage because the returns to education, this is an analysis, it's a bit old now, it's 20 years old, but the returns to education seem to be higher and stronger in more advanced economies. Results from PISA, the Programme for International Student Assessment, the ones that keep ministers awake all night and drive national education paranoia, are an indication of the extent to which education is the social policy tool. And in their 2015 education policy review, OECD conclude that globalization, innovation and growth have an important human capital dimension. The comparative advantage of many OECD countries has become their capacity to have highly skilled people who can work in knowledge-based professions. And you don't need to begin from a human capital position to find arguments for the power of education. Hanushek and Wößman reviewed the evidence in 2010. The economic and non-economic returns to education are substantial. Across international data sets, a 13% improvement in salary to those who hold a degree, improved health, half the number of disabled years for those who hold a degree, longer life, an additional 1.7 years for every additional year of schooling. Higher levels of education are associated with lower offending, higher levels of physical activity, and improved social cohesion. If you're an advertising agency, you'd really want the account for education. It really is the next best thing to a record deal. But if education's the new rock and roll, it has its downsides. Education reinforces social hierarchies as much as it disrupts them. Across the world, access to elite schools and elite universities is the preserve of the already privileged. In 2014, 0.1% of Year 11 pupils who claimed free school meals and took A-levels went to Oxford or Cambridge. On the other hand, the Sutton Trust found that in 2011, 4 highly selective independent schools, Eton, Westminster, St Paul's Boys and St Paul's Girls, and 1 state-funded but highly selective sixth form college, Hills Road in Cambridge, between them sent almost 1,000 pupils to Oxford and Cambridge, more than the 2,000 least successful schools in the country in this respect. And investments in education across social classes have diverged sharply. Greg Duncan and Dick Murnane pinned down the American data. In 1973, the richest fifth of American families spent $2,700 more on enrichment activities than the poorest quintile. At constant prices, by 2006, that figure had tripled to $7,500. And inequality is ingrained globally. Class sizes are systematically larger in the poor South than the rich North, and in both are larger in public than in private schools. Education has been used to exclude and to control as often to improve and include. One of my most striking recent reads, I recommend it to you, is David Van Weybroek's History of the Congo, a devastating account of the damage done by slavery and colonialism. At the beginning of the 20th century, education in what was then the Belgian Congo was in the hands of the church. And what were those African children taught in that vast expanse? They were taught some reading, they were taught some writing, they were taught some arithmetic, but they were also taught church history. They were taught the provinces of Belgium, and they were taught the admittedly very short history of the Belgian royal family. And again, they were taught in schools that their nation was divided into tribes, itself a largely Belgian invention. Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett, in their hugely influential book, The Spirit Level, try to spring this trap between education and inequality. They point out that educational outcomes are better in more equal societies, and they're largely right. But they ignore how far education as a positional good reinforces inequality. And those politicians who speak lovingly of the desirability of an educational meritocracy forget that Michael Young's book was in fact a dystopian vision of how an educated elite would seek to embed and secure its own position. And so this is the paradox of education and for education in the 21st century. It's the magic bullet. It's the prime call on investment. It's the intellectual infrastructure. It will make societies and individuals more productive, healthier, and safer. It will equip children with what they need in a world in which the returns are to high skill. It will enable our children to produce the wealth that will look after all of us as we age, and so on and so on. But it's a treacherous friend. It reinforces inequalities. It's a positional as well as social good. It's filtered through structures and organisations which, as we've seen, look much as the same now as they have done for centuries and work in much the same ways, reproducing hierarchies and closing doors as much as opening them. Now, there's no easy resolution to this, but there are ways, I think, to open the possibilities for education to work better than it does now, if we're much clearer about the challenges for education. And I want to work at pretty high speed through 5 that I think are critical, and I'll try to illustrate them with some pretty wide-ranging examples to tease out the difficulties. And here they are. The challenge of education for all, generating participation. The challenge of what I've called relevance, making education really useful. The challenge of flexibility. The challenge of quality, education that makes a real difference. And the challenge of funding, how at a time, with much prospect of this being very different, we pay for education. So let's start with the challenge of participation. That's an example of not wildly successful participation. It's early afternoon in a primary school in China. I started the lecture with images of classrooms, and I argued that classrooms are everywhere, and it's true. But education is very unevenly distributed. There's a lot of it about, but there's not nearly enough. It's true at every level of education, from primary school through to university. And for me, really strikingly demonstrated through the UNESCO Global Monitoring Report infographics. That one setting out the proportion of all spending on primary education spent country by country, measured in dollars, and this one setting out the disparity, small is good, the gap between investment, between female and male enrolment in primary education. If we look at higher education, we see that there are sharp disparities in enrolment ratios in tertiary education between the rich north and the poor south. Now, we know a great deal about how to improve enrolment in education. We know that investment in primary education is critically important, and that investment in girls' education, hugely so. But for all the global commitment and the Millennium Development Goals, progress has been painfully slow and too often contested. And it turns out that formal education systems have often proved ineffective in improving outcomes for the very poorest, within and across education systems. Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee, in their hugely provocative and absorbing study of poor economics, conclude that because in many developing countries, both the curriculum and the teaching are designed for the elite rather than for the regular children who attend school, attempts to improve the functioning of the school system by providing extra inputs have been disappointing. And they draw on Michael Kremer's study, one of the earliest randomized control trials of education policy interventions, to explain why. Kremer looked at schools in Western Kenya. The schools in Western Kenya had very few textbooks, despite a universal consensus that textbooks were essential. Kremer chose 25 schools randomly out of 100 and distributed textbooks. And the results were disappointing. No difference in average test scores between those who received textbooks and those who didn't. But Kremer found that the children who were initially doing well, with high test scores before the study, did even better where textbooks were distributed. His explanation: English is the language of instruction, but not all children have English as a first or second language. Inputs mattered, but changing pedagogy and practice mattered more in order to secure genuine participation as opposed simply to enrolment. So that's my first challenge, the challenge of participation. The challenge of relevance. I always start this with a set of questions. What was the most useful thing you learnt at school? What were the things you learnt at school for which you had no subsequent use? In my case, my secondary education was based on two unarticulated and utterly wrong principles. First, that I would move into a long-term personal relationship in which someone else would cook, clean, and mend for me, and that I'd have some sort of employment in which someone else would type, file, and organize for me. Like many other men of my generation, I spend a lot of time regretting that nobody ever taught me how to type, but I have learned to cook. Now, underneath this issue about relevance is a huge and titanic argument. What is it most important and useful for young people to learn? And I personalize the debate through these two individuals. E.D. Hirsch, American cultural critic, and Andreas Schleicher, the chief analyst at the OECD. Let's start with Hirsch. For Hirsch, core knowledge, what he calls core knowledge, is the social justice problem of modern education. The difference between the elites in society and the excluded is that elites have access to the cultural capital that comes from knowledge of history, arts, culture, and science. Change that, and you give the excluded tools for change. So the most important thing is that a child gradually gains a critical mass of enabling knowledge. No education reform will succeed, says Hirsch, unless we ensure that all knowledge, all children receive that knowledge from the first days of school. Schleicher, chief analyst at the OECD, takes a different view. He's the man who's driven the PISA datasets. For him, the key challenge is the challenge of skills, the choice between competing in a race to the bottom against low-cost, low-skill economies and high-skill, high-value economies. Producing more of the change, same, says Schleicher, will not do. Schools have to prepare students for jobs that have not yet been created. And the dilemma for schools, the dilemma for education systems the world over, is that routine cognitive skills, the skills that are the easiest to teach and the easiest to test, are also the skills that are easiest to digitize, automate, or outsource. Now, the battleground for this debate, which rages across North America, rages across England, rages across Australia, but the true battleground for this debate is probably here, the headquarters of Google. One of Schleicher's most oft-quoted aphorisms is this: in a world of Google, no one will pay you for knowing things. It's what you do with what you know. Now, the debate's ferocious. The advocates of knowledge-rich curricula argue that as the demands of work and society are unforeseen, the underlying knowledge base actually remains secure. Schools and universities have a fundamental responsibility to make sure that young people know things, have a solid stock of what these advocates call core knowledge to fall back on in unforeseen situations. 21st century skills, they argue, depend on some very old foundations. The foundations of reading, of writing, and thinking hard. Knowing more, argue the knowledge purists, enables learners to make more connections and ultimately to be more adaptive. And on the other hand, the advocates of knowledge in application argue that the key issue in education is to ensure that learners are able to solve problems, to apply knowledge and develop skills in unforeseen settings. For them, the demand is for 21st century skills, which make new and unpredictable demands on learners. The labour market, they say, demands analytic and communication skills, flexibility and adaptivity. And that tussle is live across education systems throughout the world. After 20 years in the UK, in which, from a conservative like Sir Keith Joseph, through a Labour minister like Ed Balls, policy leaned towards skills, it has swung sharply back under Michael Gove to an emphasis on knowledge. And there are shifts underway everywhere, sometimes parallel, as in Australia, New Zealand and North America, sometimes in the other direction, as in China, Korea and Singapore. The challenge of how we prepare young people for an uncertain future by equipping them with skills in creative problem solving or by equipping them with a secure knowledge base. And these arguments ripple through to the ways in which curricula are constructed, how pupils are taught and assessed. So my third challenge is the challenge of flexibility, how education responds to the world around it. So barely a week goes by without someone condemning education for its failures. High-status universities complain that 18-year-olds know too little. The story I always run at this point is that universities say that students come in knowing too little. They don't learn how to write essays in the sixth form. And sixth form teachers say the problem is they're not taught to read properly in the secondary school. And the secondary school teachers say the problem is they're not taught how to love books in the primary school. And the primary school teachers say that in nursery they don't learn to concentrate. And in nursery school they say they blame it on the parents. And at home we say, well, she didn't get it from my side of the family. So high-status universities complain that 18-year-olds know too little. Politicians complain that they're too apathetic about the political process. Health professionals complain that they lack understanding about healthy lifestyles and sexual health. Employers complain that children emerge from schools without the skills they need. Little of this is new. I once said that the first complaint I'd found from an employer organisation bemoaning the lack of work readiness amongst school leavers came from a 1918 report, until a colleague told me I was wrong. The first complaint was actually in 1886, just 6 years after the introduction of elementary education for all, when the complaint was that school leavers nowadays lacked gumption. The point is about the responsiveness of education to the demands of society. The layout of lecture theatres and classrooms with which I began conveys assumptions about the way pupils learn. Focus on the teacher, focus on presentation. My IOE colleague, Diana Lorillard, points out that the most widely adopted technologies in education have been those which can be accommodated in a conventional presentational pedagogy. And look at the extent to which this lecture theatre is geared around that. The immense investment in the kit here and the focus of your seats on me. If we look at that classroom in Bologna, it might as well be set up to accommodate an interactive whiteboard. Interviewed in the Sunday Times 2 weeks ago, the retiring head of Eton, Tony Little, itself scarcely a hotbed of educational radicalism, argued that the gap between the technologies of teaching and the way most young people now acquired their information was becoming so vast as to become unbridgeable. Flipped learning is an increasingly widely adopted solution to the challenge. But the fact is that education has often been too inflexible in its costings, plannings and culture to respond to technological possibilities. Moreover, questions about flexibility interact with other challenges. Information technology may indeed produce what, to paraphrase an almost forgotten advertisement, is martini learning, anytime, any place, anywhere, but only if you have the access to the technology and the facility to use it. Most of those enrolled on MOOCs, the most flexible of learning, already have degrees, doing nothing to advance the flexibility of higher education in meeting the demands across the world. Now, there are those who argue that education's great strength is its unresponsiveness. It is, in the words of Matthew Arnold, the great 19th century thinker, first HMI, a way of accessing the best which has been thought and said in the world. Education, for these observers, should not be responsive. It should insist on where it has come from. And certainly in England and America, increasingly influential educational conservatives argue strenuously not just for conservative approaches to curriculum, but also to pedagogy and to assessment, in the name of what they've described as rigour and thoroughness. But amongst assessment developers, there's increasing interest in a different approach, adaptive testing, in which computers adapt questions based on answers given earlier in the test, an on-demand or when-ready assessment. And again, these debates filter through to the everyday reality of schooling, to some extent. An example of the very inflexibility that I'm describing is, as I'm speaking, Richard and Michael in the audience are tweeting what I'm saying, and I'm seeing their tweets on my lecture coming up, and I'm not responding to them as I should. So, the great challenge is to mobilise education more flexibly for more people. My fourth challenge is the challenge of quality, always a great leap, as I say. If the lesson around the world is that investment in education can matter, it's even more the case that investment in quality matters most. Another of my IOE colleagues, Geeta Kingdon, carried out a simple but devastating piece of work in northern India. She administered to teachers in public elementary schools in North Indian states the primary mathematics examination for which they were preparing children. The results were shocking. About 80% were unable to pass the test for which they were required to prepare children. Now, it's for this reason, if for none other, that the 2007 McKinsey study of how the world's best performing education systems come out on top has had such impact. Sir Michael Barber, formerly an IOE professor, the architect of New Labour's education policy, concluded that the world's best education systems have the best teachers. The quality of an education system cannot exceed the quality of its teachers. It's routinely quoted by government ministers, reformers, and academics the world over. You'll get hundreds of thousand hits for the quote on Google. It's a great quote. It crops up in policy documents everywhere, and it's wrong. It took me a long while to work out why it was wrong, until I read this from a good friend of mine, Bob Schwartz, Professor of Practice in the Graduate School of Education at Harvard. What, says Schwartz, is the most important school-related factor in student learning? The answer is teaching. That's the difference. It's just as good a line, but it's fundamentally different. It's different in three important letters. It's teaching, not teachers, that drives quality in education, whether in kindergarten, schools, or higher education. I spent a long time before I came into higher education teaching in secondary schools. My experience, and I suspect a moment's thought from almost any of us, tells you that Schwartz has to be right and McKinsey's have to be wrong. We can all teach well, and we can all teach badly. We can all teach better. Teaching changes and develops. The three letters have absolutely enormous policy implications. If you pursue the line that the important thing is teachers, you focus on people. You focus on sacking the weakest teachers. You design a system to replace them quickly with better ones. Now, I know from a system perspective, managing poor teachers out is important. And it's really important that we recruit the best to teach in schools and universities. But actually, recruitment turns out to be a very slow route to improvement. And a bit of mental arithmetic on the English school system bears it out. There are 400,000 teachers in England. About 30,000 new ones are trained each year. Assume that the weakest 5,000 recruited each year could be replaced by 5,000 who are going to be better, definitely better, than the remaining 25,000. There are some very heroic assumptions here. Even on those heroic assumptions, it will be more than 20 years before you have a significant impact on pupil attainment. It took Finland more than 30 years for improved teacher recruitment to reshape schools. Changing teaching by changing the teachers is a very slow slog. But if you pursue the line that it's teaching that matters, you look at different issues. Recruitment and training matter, but you work continuously to improve the quality of teaching. Every teacher, in every classroom, in every institution, getting better at teaching. And you develop strategies to address the overwhelming challenge of quality. But around the world, the worst teaching is found in the most challenging environments, in whichever sector or country you look. And that involves focusing on what drives good teaching: commitment, passion, high-quality instruction that itself depends on rigorous subject knowledge and knowledge of effective pedagogy. Now, teaching is my great passion, at least in education, and I put the challenge, and I put this challenge with my tongue very firmly in my cheek into a formula for quality teaching. And there it is. And I do realise that there may be some mathematicians in the audience, so I have to say that I know this doesn't work as a mathematical formula. It's a summary of an idea. Quality of teaching, QT, is driven by C, commitment, plus E, effective pedagogy. Effective pedagogy is a function of knowledge, knowledge of subject, knowledge of teaching approaches, added to imagination, multiplied by collaboration. This, for me, is why investment in teaching, education, and professional development matters. And it's why the coalition government's decision to remove the requirement for teachers in publicly funded academies to be qualified flies in the face of evidence and experience worldwide. And so my fifth challenge, the challenge of funding. In one sense, it's very simple. As someone once said, if you think education is expensive, try the opposite. Centuries since industrialization have seen the principle of public funding for education embedded everywhere. Investment in education as a proportion of GDP has risen, but international funding challenges are multiplying. Education is a public good. It requires public funding. We all suffer from the consequences of poor education. And the efficient workings of the labour market depend on qualification levels. Indeed, the demands have been increasing. And again, very widely used, Levy and Manane's graph on trends in the American labour market. We start seeing that routine manual skills falling out of the labour market since the 1960s. Non-routine manual skills falling out of the labour market. Routine cognitive skills, the classic office data processing jobs, falling out of the labour market even faster. But analytic jobs making analytic demands and interpersonal demands increasingly shaping the American labour market. But working through the challenge of funding education produces some challenges. And I just want to work through a small number of examples that illustrate the challenge. Although it's a public good, education is also a private good. Having more of it advantages those of us who have it. Better educated people get better jobs and earn more. Elites are willing to invest not just in education, but in para-educational opportunities. If you have children, you may do the same. Music tuition, clubs, out-of-school activities, worthwhile in themselves, but advantaging children in education. Not often done to advantage children, but giving them an edge educationally. I had a conversation with a colleague in Shanghai in December. Very successful school system, and she's talking increasingly about the extent to which the private tuition, the private music tuition market growing in Shanghai. In 1998, the Deering Review on the funding of universities articulated the principle that three groups benefited from higher education. Society benefits from educated doctors, lawyers, engineers and so on. Employers benefit from having an educated workforce, and individuals benefit. Deering argued, and governments since 1998 have with increasing enthusiasm grabbed the idea that students who benefit from higher education should meet its costs. Now, I'm not going to divert into arguments about the current loan system, nor indeed about party manifestos for the forthcoming election. But public funding of university fees since the 1960s, although it funded a vast expansion of higher education, turns out to have been less socially progressive than anybody wanted it to be. There were those like me, the first person in my family ever to stay at school beyond the age of 14, but not many of my primary school friends benefited from that public funding. Where should public funding stop and private funding start? And again, you can see the argument played out in different ways in different contexts. In early years, there's a strong long-term return argument in favour of high-quality early years education, brilliantly demonstrated in an outstanding longitudinal study by an IOE team led by Iram Siraj-Blatchford. But early years provision in the UK has been overall affordable only by virtue of being a mixed market of private and public provision. Does the public interest in high-quality early years education outweigh the subsidy such investment gives to the better off who might have paid for it anyway? We provide free education for all, for 5 to 16, but we charge for additional elements. In South Korea, an education-obsessed society, 80% of children receive private tuition. In Malawi, where the state has found huge difficulties in keeping children in school, is a charitable foundation which is developing my colleague Pat Pridmore's simple but brilliant idea of the school in a bag that gives out-of-school children the basic tools for elementary education. And I think what this adds up to is a really interesting question about the point at which public funding stops and private funding starts. And as the 21st century proceeds, the way all governments, employers and individuals will deploy their funding on education is increasingly important. So, I'm almost there. These are the great challenges of education in the 21st century. To drive real participation, really useful education, to make education work more flexibly, to drive quality, and to find ways of paying for it all. I've ranged widely and superficially, and I've only given you a taster. And if the challenges are vast, however, they are not intractable. And I want to end with a bit of good news and a puzzle. 50 years ago, South Korea and Finland had terrible education systems. Finland was at risk of becoming the economic disaster of Europe, South Korea ravaged by civil war. But they both turned their education around. Change is possible, and they went about it in different ways. The Koreans have achieved something remarkable. The country is 100% literate. They're at the forefront of international tests of achievement. But success comes at a price. Students under unrelenting pressure to perform. Talent's not a consideration. The culture is one of hard work and diligence with no excuse for failure. Children study year-round, in school and with tutors. If you study hard enough, you can succeed. And Finland, a quite different route to success. In Finland, school is the centre of the community, providing not just educational services, but social services too. No child falls through the net. Education's about identity. There's a short school day, rich with school-sponsored extracurricular activities, because culturally, Finns believe learning happens outside the classroom. Testing is not developed. It's a low-stress culture. So 2 countries who've tackled the issues of participation, relevance, responsiveness, funding, and quality in radically different ways, except for one thing. Finland shares one thing with South Korea, a deep, deep respect for teachers. In both, teaching is a high-status profession with outstanding initial and career-long training. And if that neatly brings me back to the classroom and my first pictures, no apology for that, because there's no response to any of the grand challenges of education without great teaching. Thank you very much.
I don't think we're going to have time for questions, I'm afraid. We're going to need to vacate the room.
I guess I'll do two very quick ones. I'm sure we've got time for two very, very quick ones. One, two. One's... Yes?
There's been such a growth in interest in networked intelligence and how it might replace human beings in the workforce. And I just wondered, now that there are these experiments going on with replacing teachers with apps and code,
Right.
what do you predict they will find?
Okay, I'll come out to that.
First, I would say it's thrilling to see you here because it's the first time you've been here since the since the combination.
Be very brief.
I was going to ask you about the 6,000 and 9,000, but you said you're not going to answer that, I think. However, I'd like to ask you about libraries, the fact that they're shutting all over the country, and
okay. Right. Okay.
That's it.
Right. Well, there's a sort of connection between the two, which I didn't design. Look, I think that the point about apps and networked intelligence, all the evidence I've seen is that you can use, like everything else, you can use them well or you can use them badly. The really important thing, I've not seen anything which gets us away from this, and I do think library is very important on top of that, but I do try to avoid, in occasions like this, the direct political question. Right, sorry we've run out of time.
I'm sorry too. It was a fantastic lecture, lots of food for thought. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.